Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Hi, welcome. My name is Danny. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose bookstore, where we host a range of in-store events, along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as to not disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at this microphone over here on my left. For those of you that can't see it in the back, it's in front of this podium right here, to line up there to ask your questions. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Eric Dezenhall, celebrating the release of Wiseguys and the White House, Gangsters, Presidents, and the Deals They Made. In this book, Dezenhall documents when mobsters and presidents have traded favors and double-crossed each other. Combining exhaustive research, including newly released government records and the private recollections of leading gangsters, Wiseguys and the White House offers insight into the myths about the power in America and the drive for recognition and respectability that unites consigliere and commanders-in-chiefs alike. Eric Dezenhall is an award-winning author of 12 books of fiction and nonfiction, including Best of Enemies, The Last Great Spy Story of the Cold War with Gus Russo, which is being made into a feature film. He founded one of the nation's first crisis management firms and worked in the White House, where President Reagan once called him Derek. His organizational skills were deemed insufficient for membership in organized crime, but he's really trying. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Eric Dezenhall.
Thanks, Danny. I've always been interested in presidents. The first book I remember my mom ordering for me was a book about the presidents, and I got it from the Cherry Hill Mall in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. If you don't know the terrain, it's a few miles outside of Philadelphia. And it was one of those books, it was 1971, so I would have been 9 years old, and the last president was Nixon. And what was so fascinating to me was not history. I have no sense of history at 9 years old. But the idea that these guys, they were dudes, they were once kids. And I was a kid. How is it that you could be president? And I just couldn't get past it. Who are these people? Well, a few years later, I went back to that bookstore. I always made a pilgrimage back. I was in college, and I would make this pilgrimage back to the bookstore, and I ran into a childhood acquaintance of mine, whose name I will not give you accurately. I'm going to call him Vince. Interesting character. Vince, we ran in different crowds. I went to college. He went to work for the Gambinos. And when I say Gambinos, I don't mean of the Cosa Nostra family. I mean the Gambinos lived in our neighborhood. Big family compound, stained glass G on the door, actually not the door, on the front of the house. And so I got a big hug from him, and he still had the Philly accent that my mother worked very hard to extract from me. He goes, Eric, that's me. How you doing? And I said, great, where you been? And I said, I've been away to college. Yeah, where's that? And I said, Dartmouth. And he goes, where's that at? And I said, New Hampshire. And he said, that like Massachusetts? And I said, yeah, it's like Massachusetts. And he says, they got an ocean up there? And I said, well, the Atlantic is on next to New Hampshire. He goes, Atlantic? Is it like the one we got? And I said, yeah, that's like the one we got. I said, look, do you want to go in and get some pizza and catch up? He goes, no, Eric, I can't do that because me and Anthony knocked out that security guard over there and took those stereos. We got to go. And so the other kid, Anthony, recognized me. Eric, how you doing? You want stereo? And I was not, no, I'm good. Well, a few years later, I'm 22 years old, and I'm working in the Reagan White House. And my boss asked me, yeah, so you're from Cherry Hill, New Jersey. There was a big mob war going on at the time. Biggest mob war since Prohibition. And Cherry Hill was in the news because of the Gambinos and what was called the Pizza Connection, which was the largest heroin operation in the country. Not that I ever saw heroin. I did not ever see heroin, but this was management level in the suburbs. This was not what you saw in Goodfellas. This was more what you would see in The Sopranos. And my boss, she said, "So Cherry Hill, that's mafia, isn't it?" And I wasn't thrilled. I said, you could have said, "Isn't that where Muhammad Ali lives?" Which she did. She said, "Oh man, they run the country." And I went, "They do?" All I can think about is this friend of mine going, "They got an ocean up there?" And I'm told that these guys run the country. And then I thought, who are these guys? Who are these presidents? Who are the mafia? And this has been a 40-year adventure for me trying to figure out who these people are. And I couldn't help over the last 40 years or so thinking of the exchange in The Godfather when Michael Corleone is trying to win Kay back and says to her, "My father is no different than a senator or a president." And she says, "Do you know how naive you sound?" And he said, "Who's being naive, Kay?" And that line, "Who's being naive, Kay?" is always coming back to me, because in the case of the mafia and the president, who's being naive? We are. That's who. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to surf over some of the aspects of the book, just so you have a taste of it. We begin with FDR. By the way, we have a long history of working with criminals. I mean, when Andrew Jackson ran into trouble in the War of 1812 down in New Orleans, he recruited Jean Lafitte, the pirate. I mean, we do this stuff, and it happens, of course, in a democracy. And a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, the largest cruise ship in the world, the Normandy, was being retrofitted in New York Harbor for troop shipping. And the Normandy caught fire, blew up, and sabotage was widely suspected. So you can read about whether it was or not in the book. And the Navy went down to the docks. They wanted to try to infiltrate, get security people there. And Italian Americans made up most of the dock workers at the time, Irish and Italian. Now, President Roosevelt had declared Italians, Americans, to be enemy aliens. Some were interned, not like what happened with the Japanese, but this was, Italian Americans were not too thrilled to be cooperating because people thought, well, are they loyal to Mussolini, which was really not true in any material way. They couldn't get help on the docks, and they needed inroads to the Italians, and the Italians were not willing to help. But one of the prosecutors in Manhattan, Roosevelt said, "I don't care what you have to do. Do what you have to do to secure the New York ports." And by the way, this theme of do what you have to do is a big theme with not only how the mafia runs, but how people work with the mafia. And so the Navy talks to the prosecutors in New York, and one of them was a man named Murray Gurfein, who ended up becoming one of the judges on the Pentagon Papers case, and said, "You might be talking to the wrong mobsters." "Well, what are you talking about?" "Well, the Italians might not want to work with you, but you know what's happening in Eastern Europe, don't you? You should talk to Meyer Lansky." And he was Lucky Luciano, who was the preeminent Italian mobster. He was his business partner. Meyer had attempted to enlist in the army, but he was rejected because of his age. He was 40 in 1942, and his height, he was 5'4" on a good day. And I've known Meyer's family for God knows how long, had access to his thinking, his papers, and so I got an interesting perspective into this. And one of the things Meyer had done is he would send crews around to harass Nazis in New York. So you say, Nazis in New York? What are you talking about? There was a huge Nazi movement in New York, and they had rallies at Madison Square Garden, and Meyer, long before World War II broke out, he was sending crews in to beat them up. And he said he met with the Navy, and he said, this is patriotism. I'm going to help you. I'm going to talk to Luciano. But he might not be excited about this because he's doing 30 to 50 in Dannemora prison up on the Canadian border on a prostitution beat that was a little dubious, by the way. I'm not saying he wasn't a mobster, a little bit of a funny prosecution. So he goes up, he hasn't seen Luciano in 6 years, and he goes up, Luciano's excited and says, look, Meyer, I'll help out. Look at me. I'm in Siberia, which is what they called the prison. And Meyer said, I've been thinking about that. There might be something we can do about it. I'm going to get them to move you to a better prison as a goodwill. And then we're going to send word that you said it's okay to cooperate with the Navy. So what ended up happening, and I'm making, by the way, I'm grossly oversimplifying in many of these stories right now, is the mob made the waterfront very inhospitable to Nazis. And U-boats were seen in the Hudson. There were a few thousand Americans killed by U-boats before the war began. So this was not paranoia. This was a real thing. But Roosevelt did not have the support to start the war. So the Navy infiltrated the docks. And one of the things that happened when Nazis came ashore on Long Island, if you could believe this, one of the guys turned himself in, but the other ones were turned in by waiters who were part of the union that was reporting to Meyer and Luciano's people, and they caught them. And there were also 4 that came ashore in Florida. And they were executed, with the exception of 2 of them, the fastest Supreme Court case ever. Roosevelt said, I want them dead, and I want them dead now, and kept calling and going, are they dead yet? And people think of Roosevelt as this grandfatherly figure, this very liberal guy. He was absolutely ruthless and fascinated with the details of spying. So you say to yourself, okay, what does this have to do with the presidency? Well, Roosevelt knew about this. Who did Roosevelt put in charge of the waterfront operations? His best friend, Vincent Astor, whose father went down in the Titanic. Vincent Astor was working with the military, and he had his own Navy, if you can believe that. And Vincent Astor made his hotels available, because where did these people meet? The spies, where did the mob meet with the Navy? They met at the Hotel Astor. And so there's no question in my mind that Roosevelt knew. Who was Roosevelt's top propaganda advisor? That was Walter Winchell, the columnist. Guess who Walter Winchell's next door neighbor was in the majestic apartments in New York City? Meyer Lansky. And Meyer used to Winchell used to give Meyer the locations of where Nazis were meeting. And one of my favorite stories told to me by his granddaughter and confirmed in one of the letters Meyer wrote a friend is Walter Winchell gave him a bad address once, and Meyer ran into him in the lobby of the Majestic and said, Walter, you gave me a bum address here. And we got there, and there were no Nazis. And Walter Winchell was mortified that he had given one of the most powerful mobsters in the country a bum steer. Meyer, oh my God, I'm sorry, I was told it was a good dress. And Meyer said, don't worry about it, Walter. We found him. and they did. Luciano, at the end of the war, his sentence was commuted. And he went to settle in Italy because they did not want him in the United States. And uncleverly, Luciano came back a few years later to Havana with Frank Sinatra and a plane load of prostitutes, and Harry Truman wasn't too thrilled about that and said, get him back to Italy. Now we go to Truman, who is my favorite president, and by the way, the most mob-relevant president. Harry Truman, you read his biographies, he came from a political machine, but what is amazingly absent in the biographies is that the Pendergast machine in Kansas City was a mafia-controlled machine, Italian Cosa Nostra machine. Pendergast's partner was the Don, Johnny Lazia, and when Johnny Lazia was shot, he said, at least he was dying, tell boss Pendergast, I don't understand why this happened. Why would anybody do this to me, I'm someone who everybody loved? Lazia's guys would answer the phone at the police station and decide whether to dispatch cops. But so here you have a situation where there is no evidence, by the way, Harry Truman ever took a dime. Probably didn't. But he was actively involved in helping mobsters throughout his career, including when the Chicago mob got jammed up in a Los Angeles entertainment industry scandal with the unions. Harry Truman's administration arranged for the mafia bosses to get out of jail and be moved closer. One of the mafia bosses' tricks is if they can't get out of prison, would you mind just moving him closer to home? He's not feeling so well. So they gradually move them closer to home. And then finally, can you just let him work from home? And so Harry Truman was very active in this area. And one of the things I found in one of his diaries is he said, I didn't love working with these people, but I owed my career to them, and I had to sometimes let them steal in order to do some of the things I had to do. Very interesting that he acknowledged it, but not with joy. This became much more public. The question then, did people know this? The answer is yeah, but it came out gradually, and certainly shortly before, around 1950, one of the top guys in the mafia in Kansas City was shot to death in a mob war and fell dead underneath Harry Truman's picture in the Democrat Club. And the photo's in the book. And that spurred people to start to say, what's with the Democrat Club and gangsters getting killed? And Harry Truman, that was among the reasons. In addition to that, started an investigation of his wife getting a lot of money from working in the Senate on the payroll. He decided not to run again. I'm not suggesting that was the only reason, but it certainly didn't help. That was also the time the Kefauver hearings started getting worked up, and he didn't want the trouble. Interestingly, probably the most mob-relevant election was 1948, where you had Harry Truman going against Dewey, who kind of pulled his punches in the election. And one of the theories I talk about is why he pulled his punches is Dewey was under investigation for why he let Lucky Luciano. He was the one who prosecuted Luciano. Why did he let him out? And I don't think he was bribed. There's no evidence of that. But a lot of it is, and we'll see this again with Nixon, do you want to answer certain questions? It doesn't matter if you did it. It matters a little. But do you want to be answering questions about what did you know and when did you know it? And there were these problems there. I'm going to give the JFK section here a light touch. It gets a heavy touch in the book, but I've learned the hard way that people are very emotional about the Kennedys. If you hate them, you believe that JFK was stuffing briefcases for his girlfriend, Judith Exner, to give to Sam Giancana in Chicago. That's pretty preposterous. I don't think he was doing that. But if you love the Kennedys, you don't want to hear anything negative about them. And so I'm just going to give you just a light touch of what's important here. I think a lot of people think the Kennedys are one unit. They are not. They were each very different individuals, especially the big three, Jack, Bobby, Dad, Joe. And there's no question in my mind that in 1960, Joe Kennedy wanted labor help for his son in the election. And by the way, the theme of labor in the mafia is very big, and I get into in the book, what does labor have to do with the mafia? It takes too much time to explain it here, but I lay it out very, very clearly in the book why labor and the mob are married, and there's a very good reason for it. Among other reasons, they're easy to infiltrate. Joe Kennedy knew Meyer Lansky's partner, Jimmy Alo, Jimmy Blue Eyes. If you ever saw the movie The Godfather 2, there's Hyman Roth, who is Meyer, and there's a guy called Johnny Ola, who's based on Jimmy Alo. And I've known Jimmy's family for forever as well. And what they were telling me is Joe Kennedy knew Jimmy Alo from the racetracks and gambling. They owned illegal gambling in South Florida. And he approached Jimmy Alo and said, Jimmy said, I don't want anything to do with fixing elections. You might think that this is what we all like to do. This is not something I want to get involved with. Jimmy and Meyer and Luciano felt burned after going to the 1932 presidential convention where they supported Roosevelt on the condition that Roosevelt agreed to pull back on going after the mob. Well, Roosevelt got their support through Tammany Hall, the political machine, and proceeded to go after the mafia anyway. And if you'll forgive my language, Lucky Luciano was asked late in life how he felt about what Roosevelt did, and Luciano said, he is a no-good, shit-ass double-crosser. Of course, it was the right move, and I would have done the same thing. But they felt very burned by politics. And so just because you can't assume that the mafia is one central corporation. They're different people who have different agendas. I believe that Joe Kennedy sought that help. Jimmy Alo sent him to Frank Sinatra, who went to Sam Giancana. I do believe that the Chicago outfit helped. What I am skeptical about is the idea that the mafia turned the 1960 election. I think help was sought. I think help was received. But I think it's a little bit purple to start to say the mob won the 1960 election for John F. Kennedy. But labor support was whipped up. Later, we get into the dicey area of the attempts to kill Castro, which started under Eisenhower. And the Kennedys inherited it. My personal belief, and this is very controversial, is Bobby Kennedy was furious to learn that the mafia had been tapped for it. Bobby Kennedy was the original mafia buster. There's no question in my mind about it. But here's where things get interesting. Is it possible to be a mafia buster and reluctantly have to look the other way sometimes? I believe the answer is yes. Some people do not agree with me. I think that what basically ended up happening is the CIA, there's a number of very prominent people quoted in the book who say Bobby Kennedy was riding us hard to kill Castro. And the CIA ended up going to Bobby Kennedy and saying, so Bobby, you want this guy dead, but you want us to use the nicest people to do it? Is this where we are? And you'll see what you believe in the book. My conclusion to the Kennedy part, Joe Kennedy, I do not believe was a bootlegger. I believe that is a myth. And that is a very important thing to remember. Now, very responsible reporters have reported he was a bootlegger, but it has been based on the testimony of people like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. So then you say, Eric, how can you be quoting these guys and saying they're not credible sources? I think they're very credible sources on certain things. The one area where I do not find Meyer or Frank Costello, who was the successor to Lucky Luciano, credible, is they were obsessed with this notion that Lew Wasserman and the Annenbergs and the Kennedys were no different from we are than us. I do believe they're different, and the bootlegging question gets to it, and I'll conclude with that. LBJ had a problem. Civil Rights Act passed, and what happens a few days later? 3 civil rights workers go missing. J. Edgar, find out who did this. Well, J. Edgar Hoover did not have a wonderful interest in civil rights. And he ended up, there's transcripts of this. LBJ said, I don't care what you have to do. Forget the communism stuff. Get everything you do to the communists, go here, get these guys. They didn't have any people to infiltrate the Klan at that stage. But they had just flipped a guy from New York. And by flip, I mean, he was one of the first people to become a mafia, an informant, a guy from the Colombo family named Greg Scarpa, arguably one of the most lethal killers the mafia ever had. And they sent Greg Scarpa down to Mississippi because they couldn't get the FBI to get people to talk. And Greg Scarpa, on several occasions, not just the 3 civil rights workers, and Scarpa held a knife to a part where men would probably be uncomfortable with that, and put a gun in their mouth and said to the Klansmen, you tell us where the bodies are. And this was not known for decades, and bits and pieces have come out over the years, and I was finally able to get sources in federal law enforcement, not on the record, to say, essentially, we have come to the conclusion that this actually happened. And the FBI, by the way, to its credit, has become much more transparent in recent years about acknowledging past naughtiness. Not totally transparent, but more transparent. And so the way they ended, now what did J. Edgar Hoover say? It was always this rat-a-tat. We went down there and used our best people, and they investigated, and they used our best forensic evidence, and we concluded that the bodies were buried there. Well, no, what happened was a mafia guy tortured them to giving up the location. Now, if you're wondering what happened to our dear civil rights leader, Greg Scarpa, is he spent 30 years as a rat, murdering, they believe, 50 people, And our great civil rights worker had a bad stomach from chewing aspirin, and he had to have a blood transfusion, and he did not want a blood transfusion in New York because it could be contaminated with non-Caucasian blood. So he asked his crew to provide him with the blood and proceeded to contract HIV and died. So that is what happened to our civil rights leader, Gregory Scarpa. Now we come to Nixon. Nixon was always scrounging around for money. And I get into some of the details with it, but the part that was, there were two things that were very interesting to me about Nixon. The idea of labor going from Democrats to Republicans. When it doesn't make intuitive sense, you think of Republicans as pro-business, labor Democratic. But over the years, that's changed. And one of the reasons why it's changed is there was a concerted strategy. And what Nixon did was he commuted the prison sentence of Jimmy Hoffa, the leader of the Teamsters, because for two reasons. One, to get rank and file support, because to show how labory he was, and also because the Kennedys hated Hoffa and Nixon hated the Kennedys. Hoffa was happy to support Nixon. And also they had placed a new leader of the Teamsters who the mob was very happy with because Jimmy Hoffa was becoming a discipline problem. He thought the union was his. And I was very lucky in the course of this to have my friend Dan Moldea, who is to the Hoffa story what Woodward and Bernstein are to Watergate, to give me some guidance in this area. And he has been on the Hoffa story for 50 years. I don't know of anybody who's been on any case that long. I was 13, so I certainly wasn't on it that long. But Fitzsimmons was pliable. They wanted him, and they wanted him for access to the pension and other things. Well, this the commutation of Jimmy Hoffa set in motion what ended up in his death. And so we begin to see something we'll see later in Reagan with the concerted turn from Democrats, with labor to Republicans. Probably the thing that most fascinated me about working on the Nixon chapter is there was a lot in the Watergate files and records about Nixon referring to, what about the Bay of Pigs? What about the Bay of Pigs thing? And I'm, again, making a very long story short. What I've determined that meant is Nixon was very self-conscious, that he had been aware that the Kill Castro program started under Eisenhower. And he knew about it. I don't think he ran it, but he knew about it. And the thing about Nixon's mind is he was into so much stuff, he didn't know what they were going to end up getting him on. And so to understand Nixon, you have to understand the brain. And the brain was like, well, this guy knows that, this guy knows that. And I theorize that one of the things that could have inspired the break-in, and the break-in with Cubans, by the way, is I believe Nixon was very concerned about what would end up coming out about what he knew about the Kill Castro efforts and what was beginning to come out about the controversies surrounding the Kennedy assassination, including some insane things. Am I suggesting that I think Nixon ran the Kill Castro program? No, but it's unequivocally started under Eisenhower. Am I suggesting that this was the sole reason for the break-in? No, as somebody who spent 40 years in crisis management, one of the things that I've learned is seldom is it the boss giving the order, per se. It is the boss creating an environment where the people who work for him know what will make him happy and know what he's worried about. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is the possible role that his fears about what could come out about what he knew about the efforts to kill Castro. The funniest part of the Nixon chapter was something that my friend Jack Farrell, who's here and who did a great biography of Nixon, pointed me to that I hadn't known about, but I ended up investigating. There were some mobsters that couldn't stand Nixon, and they got a tip of where Nixon's where he kept some of his cash from the milk industry. And they went to their favorite burglar, and their favorite bank burglar, not robber, because that requires guns, hated Nixon. I want the money. I want to go get it. They broke into this bank in California, including blowing off the roof, and no cops came. They stayed on the roof overnight, and they blew it up again. And they went in and they got $9 million, which at that time was the biggest bank heist in history. They got the money. And they ended up capturing these guys a few weeks later because one of the guys did not turn on the dishwasher in the house where they stayed and left their fingerprints. But the part that I love is that a mob guy tipped off a mob-connected burglar who hated Nixon so much that he broke in to get where he was stealing his cash. I love comedy, and I think this is fantastic. There was a bad movie done about this, but I found out that what started out to be kind of an initial, did you hear about this, turned out to be absolutely true. Reagan. My friends from those days are not pleased with me that I included this chapter, but I couldn't not. Reagan's career mentor was Lew Wasserman of MCA, Universal. And Lew Wasserman built his business on the back of the mob. And a lot of people think, well, so the mob threatened him. It doesn't work that way quite as much. Lew Wasserman used the mafia as kind of an insurance policy to make sure things went smoothly with production in the union. So it wasn't, you better do this or I'll kill you. Sidney Korshak, the Chicago Outfit's attorney, was Lew Wasserman's best friend and a vendor. And Ronald Reagan ran into career problems in the late 40s, early 50s. And Lew Wasserman arranged for him to do a TV show called GE Theater, which was actually a pretty classy show. They showed movies, they showed plays by prestigious people. And this took Reagan from being a B-movie actor into the living rooms of Americans. This is what gave him that experience. And in return for saving his career, Reagan became president of the Screen Actors Guild and gave Lew Wasserman a waiver that allowed him to both be a talent agency and a television production company that nobody else had. Nobody questions this, and again, I have to acknowledge my friend Dan Moldea, who did a great book on Reagan and the whole mob world in the mid-1980s. But you know, what's interesting to me is you can't prove Reagan sat down with gangsters and cut deals. But here you have someone whose career was saved by someone who built their business on the back of the mob. And so it raises a question that I raised throughout the book. At what point is someone mobbed up enough? At what point does shake the hand that shook the hand become enough? And I think that what was also very interesting is Reagan led some of the most aggressive prosecutions of the mob with the commission trial in 1986 in New York. But you know who wasn't jammed up in that? The Chicago Outfit and Lew Wasserman's friends. So you have a situation where you did have prosecutions. Richard Nixon signed RICO into law, but also looked the other way at some things. So you have, and that's one of the things that was fascinating, the fact that both have this role. And I talked to some of the people I worked with back in those days, and I said, look, I didn't ask you this in 40 years, now you gotta tell me. Reagan and labor in 1980. And basically what I was told by people who ran the campaign is they realized that they couldn't get labor in 1980 on economics because Reagan was hated by labor as governor of California. But what they realized, and you can see this in our politics today, they could get labor on culture. They noticed that the people going to Reagan rallies had Western hats and Western boots and carried sidearms. And forget economics, go for culture. And they worked with Jackie Presser, and according to this former Reagan official, never a threat was made. But the Teamsters arranged for Reagan to get audiences, sound systems, and so you had this ongoing engineering of the movement of labor from Democrats to Republicans. Now we come to something that I'm sure will be of interest to many of you, the Donald. What catalyzed this book was Trump. I finally realized I had a book. Because what makes Trump unique is he is the only president who actively embraces mob ties. He has been on Letterman and repeatedly on television. He has made mafia connections a part of his brand. He wants you to know. And it's not unusual, by the way, where you see kids who grew up in affluence, who were mob adjacent, kind of wanting people to think they're part of it. And Trump is kind of a pretend tough guy. And he wants you to know. And one of the things Trump says that I reluctantly have to agree with is when he's accused of doing something naughty, he says, that just makes me smart. He's right. Because if you look at how he used the mob, it is smart. Picture a New York tower under construction. You probably picture steel beams and a crane. That's not what Trump used to build Trump Tower. He used concrete. Now, steel is an international industry. Concrete is local. It was controlled by two companies in New York, controlled by the Genovese, Colombo, and Gambino families. How did Trump use the mob to keep labor peace when there were protests and labor disruptions everywhere? He built Trump Tower out of concrete and paid a nice price. There is no tort against overpaying for concrete. Some of these guys went to jail for this. Trump did not. And a former prosecutor friend of mine said, but Eric, you're wrong. If you could prove that those payments for the concrete got him labor peace, and I said, stop right there. It's been 45 years. No one's proven anything. And so I asked an uncle of mine who was involved with that world in Atlantic City. I said, this was years ago. I said, well, Trump mob, what is this? What does that mean? He goes, oh, you want to know? I said, yes, I want to know. He overpays for real estate. For those of you who are Bruce Springsteen fans, there was a song called Atlantic City. They blew up the Chicken Man in Philly last night. Chicken Man was a guy named Phil Testa. His son was a guy named Salvi Testa. Salvi Testa had a property on the boardwalk, near the boardwalk, that was valued at $195,000. Trump paid $1.1 million. No labor peace, bought it through a secretary. And so I reluctantly inform you that when Donald Trump says that makes me smart, I believe it does. Because what he also did was his use of Roy Cohn. When he met with mob figures, he did so at the home of Roy Cohn. You are allowed to meet with an attorney, attorney-client privilege. But Eric, if you're not really talking about legal cases, it's not privilege. Trump can't help it if he ran into someone in the hallway who's another Roy Cohn client. Well, it's been decades. No one's proven anything. And this is a very important theme, and I'll conclude with the bootlegging point about why all of this is important. We come to Biden, not a major mob-type character, but his father had a lot of interesting connections in the old days. And in the 1972 election, he was projected to lose. He was running against an incumbent. And the Philly mob tapped a man known as the Irishman, Frank Sheeran, of the Teamsters, and Frank Sheeran made sure that there was an ad that was supposed to be devastating to Biden that his opponent was going to run in the Delaware newspapers. The Teamsters made sure that those newspapers were never picked up and delivered. Can I prove Biden knew? No, but this is how things happen. Therefore, what? What have we learned here? I said that Joe Kennedy wasn't a bootlegger. He wasn't a bootlegger because he didn't have to be. What made Joe Kennedy smart, and what made a lot of these characters smart, the people who knew how to use gangsters did better than the gangsters. The politicians and the businessmen. And gangsters did fine, not being naive here. But Joe Kennedy was legally in the liquor business. He did not want to be for Joe Kennedy to be a bootlegger would be like Warren Buffett deciding in the 1990s, you know what, I'm going to become a drug dealer. Why? Joe Kennedy made a fortune in what was then not illegal, but is now called insider trading. Roosevelt made him the first SEC chair, but he danced along the line. and appearance matters. He would never have become a bootlegger because, number one, he was terrified of the idea of being associated with being a drunk Irish person. He did not want to work with the Italians, and he really didn't want to work with the Jews, who he referred to as Canadians, because it was a code word. He was making money unethically, but legally. Donald Trump danced along the line. Lew Wasserman danced along the line. Mo Annenberg, who made his money initially in the distribution wars of newspapers, went to jail, paid a tax fine, but made sure his son was legitimate. And I think that probably the biggest reason why the FBI did not go after the mob has nothing to do with Meyer Lansky keeping a photo of him, which is what one biographer of Hoover said. He kept the photo in his safe deposit box. I've been in Meyer Lansky's safe deposit box. There is no photo, and his business partner, Jimmy Alo, said at almost 100 years of age, if there were a photo, I would have known about it. I'm 100 years old, no reason to lie, there was no damn photo, we didn't control him. Hoover chased Meyer out of the country to Israel, which is true. The real reason Hoover didn't go after the mob, communism. That was his focus. That was the focus of Congress. That was the focus of the presidents. That is what everybody was looking for. Go get the communists. But all of this, and by the way, the mob funded some of these anti-communist efforts. They wanted unions to look bad about communism because it gave them more power. And at the end of his life, Lucky Luciano said, these days you need a license to steal from the public. Had I to do it over again, I would have gotten that license first. And this is what we're seeing today. The way to do something naughty is to do it out in the open. You can be the president's son-in-law and get $2 billion from Saudi Arabia, and nobody cares. It's like, well, and by the way, one of the things that Trump, you gotta love it, 2 minutes after he's on Letterman saying, yeah, I dealt with mobsters, somebody will go, but did you deal with mobsters? No, I would never do that. People are like, okay. I mean, if I could get away with it, I would. And so getting away with it is a skill in and of itself. And my concluding remark would be this. We've all heard in Washington, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Cover-ups work just fine. Not all of them, but cover-ups are cover-ups. The whole idea is to get away with it. And that's what many of these people did because this mafia stuff was covered up for a long time. So with that, I thank you. Happy to take your questions. Thanks for listening. Yes, sir.
So this is really fascinating. Could you talk another 30, 50 minutes? I love your stories. You're a great storyteller.
My wife will have issues, but yes.
I'm really not knowledgeable about the history of organized crime in this country. Can you give 30 seconds? Or do these groups stay in business? Or is it like whack-a-mole? They're pushed down, they come back up. Is it the same cast of characters throughout our history, or does that change?
It changed. I mean, you know, if you were to look at if you looked at some of our founding fathers, you could say they were gangsters. The Scots-Irish. Hey, Indians, am I moving over? You don't want to move over? It'd be a shame if you got some smallpox. Okay, so they were rough customers. Then we go to the late 1800s. Gangs were heavily Irish. Very early 1900s, most powerful in New York mobsters were Jewish. Then you get to the 1940s, and the Italians push everybody else out because, you know, and in Hollywood, the moguls there would much rather have a mobster named Rico than Saul. And so, you know, and then things come full circle. Now you have the Russians. A lot of the Russians are Jewish. And so it just changes. I mean, there's nothing particularly criminal about one ethnic group versus another. It has to do with immigration, when you got here. And this is one of the reasons the African-American community has so much trouble with, I mean, I have a friend who's a former Philly gangster, part of a Philly drug gang, and he's no less bright than any of us, but he came late to the game in terms of when he was allowed to have rights and have access. I mean, I'm not sure that, you know, one of the things you hear about these guys is, you know, had they gone straight, they would have been the CEO of General Motors. I think that there's something about these guys, even though the environment did have a lot to do with it, some of these guys have a capability that the rest of us don't. And what makes gangsters different than us is not the toughness per se, it's the will to violence. Whereas if I say, you know, threaten you, I'm just trying to back you off, I really don't want to fight. These guys will use violence immediately, and that's what makes them different.
Thank you.
You bet. Professor Swerdlow.
Yes, sir. I admire all your books.
Thank you, sir.
Total scope of stupidity and corruption in Washington. How important are these violent people? People who are organized and will use violence. Are they romantic movie type people, or are they really significant? What's the trend?
You mean like the January 6th crowd?
No, the whole trend in Washington, power in Washington. People who use violence. Is it less and less? Different people, the same?
Well, I don't know whether I'm nailing your question, but I think that what I've seen happen is less the use of gangs than the use of open money politics. You know, you can legally donate a fortune to get what you want. I mean, you are seeing some of these big companies essentially giving money to the president, and it's all legal. And so I think what's happening is Luciano was right. You need a license, and if you donate a lot of money in some way, there's no tort there. You can get what you want that way. And so I believe that the mafia right now is secretly, you know, influencing presidential campaigns? No, I don't. But I do believe that what happens is the systems morph into something else.
When you talk about mafia, you're talking about Italian mafia or organized crime?
Organized crime. I don't think that, I think where you have to watch organized crime is if you know, one of the things that Meyer wrote in his private notes, he wrote to a friend that casino gambling will become the biggest business in America once they run the Italians and Jews out. And casino gambling is, in fact, the fastest growing business. You have this in sports. And we don't know yet who will be controlling all of this gambling. Plenty of it will be legal, but this is the Wild West right now. And it's something to watch, and I don't have enough expertise to tell you where it's going, but to me, the way to do it is to wrap things inside something legitimate.
So your message is that the mafia has become normalized.
The mafia, you don't need to be a criminal to get done the things you used to have to get done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Hi.
Hey there, thank you for doing this. You mentioned at one point that people like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello were very invested in this idea that people like the Kennedys were no different than them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that was just them trying to justify themselves, or did they actually have like a sentimental attachment to this idea that they were another version of the American dream? Frank
Costello saw a psychiatrist because he didn't like being seen as a criminal. And the psychiatrist told him that he needs to start hanging around better people. And so he started doing that, which ended up him getting shot in the head, survived, by his gang, the Genovese, who said, no, you're not a yuppie. You know, you want to be a gangster or not. I think that some of these people never tried to make the turn. One of the things you hear about Meyer, and one of the reasons I wrote this book and I wrote a novel about his efforts during World War II, I fictionalized what is basically true. Meyer he did not want to be a gangster. What he was hoping for was to be Annenberg, Wasserman, Kennedy. He thought that this was a stepping stone to doing what he did in Cuba, which was legally owned those casinos. Now, where the money came from originally, that's another point. He really wanted to make that turn. He failed because when Kefauver came around, he became associated with the rackets. Now, the person who he envied was a guy named Mo Dalitz. And Mo Dalitz was a guy who started with the Cleveland mob who ended up owning shares in these casino companies. And one of the things that Jimmy Alo said at the end of his life is, We thought these guys who owned the shares in the corporations were our fronts. The joke was on us. We were burying our money in tin cans in the backyard while these guys had stock certificates. They got us in the end. And so I do think that they wanted to see themselves as no different. But look, there's no evidence that Joe Kennedy ever killed anybody. Sure. There's no evidence that Lew Wasserman did, or if it was done, there were layers. Just like with Trump, there were layers. And my argument is the layers, however superficial, matter. And you know, we have a president who was able to use layers and did just fine. What goes around does not come around, not even a little. But it did for the gangsters. They could not outrun it.
Thank you.
You bet.
This was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
All stuff I didn't know. I did work for the United Mine Workers at one point, and as far as I know, they were not involved with gangs. They were involved with violence for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know much. I don't know much about them, but I've heard a lot about them.
What was your connection with Lansky? He didn't live in Cherry Hill, as far as I know.
No, I mean, there is some sensitivity about how I answered that question publicly, but there were people in my background who knew him. Okay. And I don't really know how it originated. I do know I have an uncle who had some involvement in Cuba, and I do have a grandparent that was in the alcohol business at a rather interesting time in our history. But it was before my time, so I was so far removed that, you know, there's a saying that what the son seeks to forget, the grandson seeks to remember, and I think I probably fall into that category.
Thank you.
You bet.
I noticed you skipped over a few presidents.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, you did. Two come to my mind are H.W. and Bill Clinton.
Because I could not find meaningful mafia ties. You know, somebody said to me, you know, the Clinton crime family. Well, you don't have to like the Clintons, but the only thing about the Clintons is one of my neighbors, one of the Gambinos, bought Roger Clinton a Rolex with the hope that Bill Clinton would pardon him. Bill Clinton did not pardon him. I see no evidence that Bill Clinton had any material ties to the mob. I see no evidence that the Bushes did. I see no evidence that Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford or Eisenhower did. And that is why I skipped over them, because we're talking about mafia crime, not general crime.
Yeah, no, I get it. And the other thing is, did you nail the idea that Sheeran did away with Hoffa? Or
I don't believe that. No.
You don't?
No, not at all.
Because?
I think Sheeran knew Hoffa and was involved with Hoffa's affairs, but I do not. I believe that, as my friend Dan has said, The Irishman was fantastic entertainment, but not really a historical document. I don't think, according to a friend of mine, an FBI agent, Sheeran never killed anybody. He was a leg breaker. But he needed money, and he told a story at the end of his life. And one of the problems with writing about the mob is these guys don't exactly have a wonderful pedigree for keeping detailed records. And so you have, you run into a problem when you're talking to a mobster, and you see this in the spy world too, who never heard of an event that happened that they didn't personally have an in on. I mean, I talked to one guy, a Philly-wise guy. If you brought up Julius Caesar, you'd go, let me tell you something. That wasn't Brutus and Cassius. That was my Vinny Bag of Donuts. He was in the Caesar for 50 large. Okay, so you know what happened 2000. Okay, fine. But look, there was a time in my life that I once heard that and went, really? I mean, I believed anything.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. If no other questions, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have fun with the book.